It's time for another episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my good friend, William Boekestein, and we're going to be discussing 3 books because we're crazy and we're just going to make it happen because, well, he's been on a publishing journey the past year and a half. We're going to be talking about these 3 books: Contending for the Faith, the story of the Westminster Assembly; Stubborn Prophet, Faithful God; and last but not least, the best day of the week, Why We Love the Lord's Day. Bill, in terms of publishing and being an author, you are a glutton for punishment, my friend. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks, Sean. So good to be talking with you. I didn't intend to publish 3 books within the course of a month or 2, but 2020, 2021 has been weird with backlogs on everything, and this is what happened. So, but really grateful to be talking with you and reconnecting with you.
Yeah, that is one of the positive elements, I think, of people being stuck at home and just kind of, in terms of fallout, a good thing. There is no lack of books waiting to see the light of day in bookstore shelves in this season. As I was getting ready for our conversation, I was looking back, and I think we last talked, at least on the podcast, back in 2019. And so my audience has grown significantly since then. So for the benefit of all those meeting you for the first time, give us a little bit of context. Give us the elevator pitch version of the Bill Boekestein origin story. What are a few things they should know about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, my wife, Amy, and I have 4 children, 3 teenagers and a 7-year-old. So that's a small family, isn't it, Sean? So, so we have been in Kalamazoo for about 7 years, and really thankful. I pastor Emmanuel Fellowship Church here in Kalamazoo. Lovely church family here. A real blessing to me. I've been blessed along the way as I've been pastoring for about 14 years to be writing as well. And actually, one of the books, The Best Day of the Week, I started that book about 10 years ago, thinking that it would be helpful for our little children who were little at the time. And for one reason or another, it's come to be published just a few weeks ago. And so I'm thankful to be preaching, to be pastoring, to be journeying with our church family here in Kalamazoo and writing as the Lord gives opportunity as well. Thanks for you and your help and sharing the story with others as well.
Oh, my pleasure. And it's just fun in this season. I've been in the Christian publishing space for about a decade now, and one of the great joys is just connecting with people you've been on the journey with and bumped into through the years. I think we're all just excited to see that some of us have survived into these latter stages in ministry, in publishing. And so, yeah, it's always fun to see friends from the past, even if it has to be virtually, because I never get back to Michigan these days. I think the place I'd love to start is with Contending for the Faith, the story of the Westminster Assembly. In terms of the artwork and the illustration, it reminded me of another series that you have. Is this meant to be part of that, or just kind of an add-on, if you will, to that series? So how did this one get started?
Great question. So you're right. We've talked previously about 3 books that I published on sort of introducing the Reformed confessions for children. So the Heidelberg Catechism, Canons of Dort, Belgic Confession, 3 historic documents that have guided Reformed Christians in terms of their understanding of the Bible for centuries. And this book is meant to really be the last book in that series. And so this steps out of continental Europe and into the British Isles, and also moves just a little bit closer to our time. So still 17th century, but 1640s, and tells the tumultuous story of the English Civil War and how religion and an understanding of what the church should be like, how that played a role into the conflict in England. And so, Sean, this is surely the most niche of the 3 books that we're going to be talking about. It won't, not all of your readers have read children's books on 17th century confessions of faith. But I will say this: every Christian has a creed, a confession of faith, a short version of what they believe. Now, not all of us know that that's true, but it is true for all of us. And so you might say, well, my creed is just the Bible. I simply believe the Bible. But as soon as somebody says even a simple question like, what Bible? How many books are in your Bible? And who is the main character? So the main character of your Bible is Jesus, but who is Jesus? As soon as you start answering that question, you're articulating a creed or a confession of faith. And so all Christians use creeds, but for Presbyterian Christians, the three official creeds that are utilized were formulated in the 1640s at this Westminster Assembly. And so, particularly for the benefit of those who subscribe to these documents theologically, we want to introduce them to children. But I think it's a fascinating story for anybody who loves history and religion, and how history and religion can work in together into the same story.
Well, and you hit on one of the most feared questions when you work in a Christian bookstore is, can you help me? I need to find a Bible. And then, an hour or two later, you hope they walk out of there with a Bible, and that you don't somehow offend them by recommending a Bible that is not approved by their church
Right.
affiliation.
That's
So
right.
never a lack of excitement there.
Yeah.
I think the thing I like about this series overall, and I came up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, so I went through confirmation, and we got to know Luther's Small Catechism forwards and backwards, and one of the big kind of difficulties, or I almost feel like ways that we're doing a disservice to kids coming up these days, is there is nothing built into a lot of evangelical church rhythms of actually studying a catechism or understanding these confessions of the faith. You could come up in an evangelical church these days and never actually hear any of these confessions of the faith. And so, sadly, we do have a large segment of society who is ignorant of church history overall, and just, where some of the ideas that we just believe, where did they come from? And so, even though it's very niche, resources like this, I feel like, are significant to help us not lose touch with our past. Because the reality is, if we don't know what those who came before us, kind of the battles they fought and the debates they won, maybe, if you will, we're doomed to repeat the same things, and we're going to think everything that comes at us is new and brand new. And the reality is, those that came before us actually have fought most of these same battles. A lot of these new ideas are often the same heresies that are the mothers and fathers of the faith who came before us. They put these to rest. So just super important, I think, for this age. Any parting thoughts on this one in terms of takeaway, really how you hope you impact the people that encounter it? Maybe even a little bit of kind of the age range, because it is meant for a slightly older audience than the best day of the week.
Yeah, exactly. So it's fully color illustrated, but probably is geared toward kids about 7 to 12. Although I keep hearing from parents of 7 to 12-year-olds saying, I learned an awful lot about the Westminster Assembly. I would just add this, though, Sean, even for readers or for listeners who would answer some of the questions differently than the Westminster Shorter Catechism does, for example, the Catechism asks the right questions that a lot of us we might not even be asking today. And so the Catechism asks questions about, for example, what is prayer? And then walks us through the Lord's Prayer. And so even if your church tradition might pray differently, you've got to recognize the Lord's Prayer and what that does for your church. And then how do we live godly? Well, the Catechism asks that and then works through the 10 Commandments. And however anybody applies the 10 Commandments, this is the bedrock of morality for Christians, as it's also interpreted in the New Testament. And so I think what this book helps to do is introduce how those who have gone before us have at least asked the right questions, and I think given good answers, but at least they can sort of prod us to answer the questions for ourselves.
And I'm glad you mentioned, too, that you're getting feedback from readers, especially parents, who are saying, hey, I learned something new that I hadn't known about the Westminster Assembly. And that is one of the really key things about children's books in this day and age. Obviously, kids aren't running out to buy these children's books.
Right.
It's well-meaning aunts and uncles, grandparents, parents, and it's often adults who are reading books to kids. And so in the same way that you are reaching children, you're actually reaching adults with a lot of these topics and concepts. And the reality is, many people didn't have the benefit like you and I did of growing up in church or going to Bible college. And so we can't reasonably assume that everybody has the same level of exposure just to the Bible and Bible stories and all the things that we had as kids. And so in the same way that these children might be encountering these things for the first time, these adults might be as well. And so I feel like the value of Christian children's books has gone up significantly in the past few years. And I've been happy to see a resurgence. We kind of fell into the space where everybody kind of stopped producing children's books for a while. Some of that I think is just because of the loss of retail spaces, which has certainly been a challenge because children's books tend to be you're browsing and you find them, and that's why you pick them up. But the majority of the Christian publishing houses are getting back into children's books like they were in the 90s and 2000s, which is certainly an encouraging movement within the publishing space. Well, let's transition now to the second book for our discussion today, and that is Stubborn Prophet, Faithful God. I feel like the book of Jonah is one of those books that we know snippets of the story, and we've seen it represented in a VeggieTales movie or here or there. It's one of those larger than life stories, but I don't think a lot of us have really processed it theologically to a significant degree. So I guess the place to start with this one, again, kind of that story behind the book. What was the why of this for you? What were you wrestling with that you poured into this new book?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right, Sean. It's the kind of story that we have images of in our minds because of Sunday school curriculum or whatever. And so when I was teaching through this book to our congregation a few years back, my hope was that we would be able to introduce the story in an engaging way, in a way that helps us to see the main character of the book of Jonah. Because I think, Sean, one of the big problems with our understanding of Jonah is that, particularly because the book is named after him and he seems to be the main character, we know about Jonah. We know about his stubbornness. That's why the book is entitled Stubborn Prophet. He's a stubborn prophet. We know about the success that God grants him near the end. We know about his time in the great fish. But really, the main character in this book is God. And I think sometimes we miss that theological emphasis in the book. And so that's why we've got this contrast between the stubborn prophet and a faithful God. And, we do know Jonah as a missionary. And so I think sometimes Jonah, the book, is looked at as sort of a missionary manual, which it is, I think. But Jonah is not the kind of missionary that we would ever want to call to serve our church, right? Or to send out into a mission field. I mean, he's almost an anti-missionary in a lot of ways. And so the book actually focuses our attention using Jonah as a foil on the missionary God. And so that's what you're going to find in this book is just an emphasis on Jonah's shortcomings, which we can all relate to, but how God actually rescues Jonah. He rescues the whole story, of course, including the Ninevites. But so it actually focuses our attention on the only perfect missionary, which is God himself. But then along the way, and particularly what I focus on at the end of the book, is some intriguing ethical questions that the book of Jonah raises. Things that I didn't focus on so much when I studied the book years ago, and then took it up again. I started thinking, there's some things that, like fasting, for example. Now, I don't know if in your tradition, you emphasize fasting. And in the tradition I am in presently, it's not an emphasis. And in fact, it's almost suspect. And so, unfortunately, and so we look at the fasting of the Ninevites, and we have to ask the question, is that something that was peculiar to their day and age, or should we still fast today? And so in the concluding part of the book, focus on fasting as a discipline that actually has been rightly emphasized throughout most of church history. And we should really be, I and people in my tradition really need to recover that, I think. Another question that Jonah raises for us is, how do I know God's will? And I bump up against that question when I see how the sailors sought to know God's will by casting lots. And so that asks the question, should we still cast lots today? Are there sort of shortcuts to knowing God's will, like lot casting is? And again, I don't know what you and your tradition, how you utilize that, but as you walk through the Bible, you see that lot casting played an important role, but then there seems to be a shift in the New Testament to sort of broader understanding and the gift of the Holy Spirit. And so I want to interact with actually not shortcuts for knowing God's will, but a more sure and confident approach to knowing God's will than using casting of lots. And then also finally the third ethical question that really kind of shook me was the question of how should I interact with animals? What should my view as a Christian be of animals? And God, at the end of the book, asks Jonah, should he not have cared about animals had the city been destroyed, which is really what Jonah cared about. He says there's all these people and animals. And I'm sure for the first many, many times I read the book, I passed over that idea of animals because, yeah, it just didn't really register with me. But so we walk through sort of an animal theology, why animals were not a throwaway point in God's argument for Jonah's compassion, and what it means to be, this is going to be hard for me to say, Sean, but an animal lover in a biblical sense, because I don't consider myself to be an animal lover in that sense. But how do you do that? How do you care about animals theologically? And that's been really, really a shift for me as I've worked through that.
Wow, I never thought we'd ever get to a point in the podcast in all these years about asking the question, how do we care about animals theologically? Although
Yeah.
I would put that under the umbrella of stewarding creation, which
Correct.
is a huge theme that I think many of us are fairly comfortable with. I love that you described Jonah as the anti-missionary, and I think a lot of us find through the years, the things that scare us the most or the things that we try to resist the most are often the thing that God is calling us to step into, because it's only by his power and only by his grace in our lives that we can actually achieve the thing or be successful. If it was up to our own devices or abilities, we would fall flat or we keep running the other way.
That's right.
I think the place I'd love to land the discussion about Jonah is just, do we believe the story? That we read this in scripture. Did this really happen? I think people really struggle with this idea of a guy getting swallowed up by a big fish and spit back out on the shore of a country he's supposed to be a missionary to. For the person listening to or viewing this who says, that story's kind of crazy. It's just, it's like a folk tale. What do we do with it? Since it's in the Bible, shouldn't we take it seriously?
Well, that's a great question. We should take everything in the Bible seriously, but we should take everything in the Bible seriously in its own way, in its proper way. So, for example, a parable. Now, I don't think Jonah's a parable, but if you take a parable in the Bible, you should take that seriously. But you should do so in a way that respects the fact that it's a parable. Jesus was telling a story. It didn't really happen, but it should be taken seriously. That's the way some Christians or some critics view Jonah, as sort of a parable that maybe should be taken seriously, but in a way that is non-historical. And I think that is, for a lot of reasons, a really inappropriate way of understanding Jonah. First of all, there's all kinds of historical markers in this story. So the fact that Jonah is introduced as Jonah, the son of Amittai, he lists the name of his father. And the fact that we know other things about Jonah from the Bible. If I were to say to you, Sean, let me tell you a story about a man. As soon as you'd hear that, you'd think, well, he doesn't even say his name. He doesn't say where he's from. It's probably just a story. It's probably just a parable. Jonah doesn't do that. The other thing that's really critical about this question of the historicity of Jonah is the fact of his surviving, drowning in the water and surviving some time in a great fish. It's truly no more unbelievable than the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I mean, dead people don't rise again, right? If you have a view that the universe is closed and that there is no God superintending all things. And so if Jonah is too difficult for a person to believe, you actually end up having to dismiss almost everything. You have to become sort of a Thomas Jefferson and say, well, I'll accept the ethical portions of it, but not the historical portions of it. But then you miss the most important historical reality, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So Jesus himself says, as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for that same period. And so I find it strange to think that Jesus would latch on to a fictional story and say, this is why you should believe in the most important thing you could ever believe in because of this fictional story of Jonah. It seems really odd that he would do that. So I'm very convinced, as are actually most scholars that come to this story. They say, no, this is just God's powerful working in history. It's unusual. I mean, I've never had an experience like that. But then so are many things that happen in this world. There's a lot of things that I can't explain. And I think most critics of Christianity can't explain. They just don't allow God to be the answer to those conundrums. And so, yeah, strange story, but no stranger than much of the Bible, and no stranger than many of the things that we encounter in our life as well. So I think we have to agree that it is meant to be read as history, and then we'll read it as we ought to.
Well, I think you can put Jonah in kind of the same bucket as some of what we read in Genesis and other things that people try to write off as it was a fairy tale or it was fictional, or it's just kind of trying to give an origin story for something. And then we start falling off this very slippery cliff when we get to the New Testament. And Jesus is referring back to these things as if they're fact and they're true. And there are some pretty significant theological points that need kind of the underpinning of these accounts from the Old Testament to stand on. So it's a slippery slope once we start throwing things away. I mean, that's one of the things I've always appreciated about Ken Ham's ministry, Answers in Genesis. Like, until I encountered some of their material, I was just like, whatever, who cares? And then I read a few of Ken's books and interviewed him. I was like, oh, this is actually extremely important. If we start throwing some of this away, where do we stop? You just gotta keep, getting out your scissors and clipping stuff out, and then you got nothing left to stand on. So
that's right.
Yeah.
No, it's a really helpful ministry, Sean. I don't know. Have you been to the Ark Encounter?
I've not been to the Ark Encounter. I've been to the Creation Museum. Okay. They were still building the Ark Encounter when I was there.
Well, both fantastic. I remember thinking once we got off the tour bus, which brings you to the Ark Encounter, literally just stepping off the bus and seeing the Ark was worth the price of admission in my mind, because you get a sense of, wow, that's really big, but it also could be built, and it was built. And so, it's really helpful ministry. I agree with you entirely. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have saved the best for last. We're going to wrap up the interview talking about the best day of the week, why we love the Lord's Day. Now, you said this was something you kind of sat on, stewarded, were thinking about for 10 years. Why did this take so long to come to life?
Yeah. Well, why does so many things take as long as they do, Sean? So we started working. My wife and I kind of started working on this book. She helped me a little bit here and there when our kids were pretty little, because for one thing, as a pastor, I'm almost never sitting with my family during worship. I'm preaching, leading worship. So my wife is juggling the kids during worship. And so we thought, well, it would be wonderful to give them a book that kind of walks them through sort of at least for us, a typical worship experience, so that they could have a better understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, and give mom another tool. So we started quite a while ago, and then you know how it is. One thing comes, things come up and push other projects aside, and actually, to be honest, through the process of several different publishers considering it, but saying, well, it doesn't quite fit, maybe our audience, but here's some ways that you could make it more applicable to folks that are maybe just a little bit outside of your target audience. I think in the end ended up making it better than it would have been had we published it 10 years ago. So the basic idea, Sean, is just to allow a child who's telling the story to walk other children through the Lord's Day, what we call the best day of the week, and understand that worship is for children, that children aren't intrusions into the worship service. They're part of the service. So I think that, and actually this is the way the boy who's telling the story starts. He says, well, every church is a little bit different. Every family is a little bit different. But all of us who follow Christ, I'm quite sure, want children to be part of that experience of worship. And so, again, not everybody's going to have, the same particular points of worship experience, but we want children to be part of that experience. And so the book helps at least to sort of whet the appetite to say, kids, this is your day too. It's not just a day for adults. Jesus loves the little children and wants you to be worshiping him in response as well. So that's the motivation, to encourage children to be worshipers. I mean, they are worshipers no matter what, but to help them to worship, properly and biblically.
Well, I love that you're drawing the children in by telling a story through the eyes of a child. I think that's a very helpful way to just get them to relate right out of the gate as they get into the story. In terms of the age range, obviously a bit younger than the first book that we talked about. What's the target age range for the book?
Yeah, we're shooting for something like probably 3 to 10, something like that. So I did a read aloud at Reformation Heritage Books a couple weeks ago, and that was basically the audience of folks who were there, and everybody seemed to hang with it really, really nicely. Now, of course, I I know in every not in every worship tradition, children aren't always present in worship, and so I personally think they should be. But even for those who aren't, how do we make sure that children aren't feeling like they don't belong with the congregation? And so even in churches that may teach children in a different setting, how do we make sure that they see this experience for them? I think there's an argument to be made for including children in worship, but how do we help them to be worshipers in whatever setting or venue they find themselves in? That's really the burden of the book.
Well, and the reality is, if we get our kids comfortable being in church and used to being in church at a young age,
Yeah,
those things that are built into the rhythms of life as we're coming up, those often stick with us throughout our life. And so it's critically important that our children are a part of worship. It's for all the folks with young kids out there. Bill and I both know how stressful that is. We've been there. Some of us are still there. I mean, heck, my youngest is still 2.5, but it takes time. But kids can learn to sit and to listen and to pay attention and interact and be amongst adults. They don't always have to be, squirreled away or taken away to,
right.
to children's church or Sunday school. They can
Yeah,
be in the worship service. And I think it's really important because, to take somebody who's only been in Sunday school and then expect at, fourth or fifth grade or whatever age, they should all of a sudden have the attention span and know how to act inside the sanctuary.
right.
That seems kind of unrealistic. That's a depending on your church context, that can be a night and day different sort of change to go from the fun of Sunday school to maybe even a
Correct.
90-minute service. Like
That's right.
what fourth or fifth grader is going to be comfortable with that if they've never experienced it
That's
before?
right. Well, I love the word that you used, Sean, the idea of habit or ritual. And if we think that children can't benefit from the ritual of worship, we forget about how children, how they. I mean, try changing one of your children's habits. Try not tucking them in some night if that's what they're accustomed to, or try not putting their water bottle next to bed when you put them to bed. I mean, they get rhythms, they get habits, they get customs, and so if you, I believe with you that with what you're saying, that if you include children from truly before they're able to fully grasp all that is happening, or even much of what's happening in the service, if you include them, it will become part of their rhythm, to which then we trust God will add understanding and will fill out those rhythms. But if you don't have the rhythm in place, you're right, it's going to be really hard to add in later. And I would add one more thing here as well. And I touch on this in a note to the parents at the end of the book, but it's not simply the rhythm of worship. It's also the fact that we truly believe. I think as evangelical Christians, we must believe that God is actually present in the worship service. We hear in Hebrews chapter 13 that when we come as worshipers, we're actually coming to the New Jerusalem. We're coming into the presence of God and of the risen Christ and of all of those who mystically we commune with, who have gone before us, and angels and all of the rest. And why would we want children to be absent from that experience? Now, I know it's not, the worship experience isn't always as glorious experientially as Hebrews 13 describes it. But if we believe that God is truly present and meeting with us, then we would want our children to be there as well, so that they're not only sensing that they belong and experiencing, and sort of being inculcated in rhythms that they can develop their whole lives, but also actually meeting with God. What a beautiful experience that I would not want to deprive any child of. So, but you're right, it requires some training and some understanding and filling in why they're doing this, and maybe some discipline along the way. But that's part of what the book that we've written here is meant to kind of help parents to do.
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea to put together a book like this. And the reality is, in terms of rhythms and worship, things are often more caught than taught. And so our kids watch us, they mimic us. And so them just being present with us in the midst of worship, in the midst of a service, they're going to catch a lot more just by mimicking and seeing what we do than us constantly telling them things. So it is very important for them to be present with us. Bill, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about these 3 books, all your other books and resources, you're very prolific. So you got a lot of books out there. Where do we discover you on the web?
Well, a couple of different places, Sean. All of the sermons that I preach from week to week are available at sermonaudio.com. And I would say that's honestly, it's maybe unusual, but that's one of the places I would encourage people to go, because it is really the primary thing that I do is teach and preach the Word of God. I have some fun on Facebook and Twitter occasionally as well, but I would say that would be, I would encourage people to go to sermonaudio.com and look up our church, Emmanuel Fellowship Church, and if possible, occasionally jump in and join us with worshiping the Lord with our children.
Well, and we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links to the Bill's Sermon Audio page. We'll have links to places where you can buy each of these books as well. We make it easy. You click on through. It's all right there for you. Sadly, it is time to bring this episode of the Sean Tabbett Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with William Boekestein. Once again, our books today were Contending for the Faith, the story of the Westminster Assembly, Stubborn Prophet, Faithful God, and last but not least, but I think the smallest book of the bunch, The Best Day of the Week, Why We Love the Lord's Day. And Bill, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. I look forward to reconnecting with you because it's been way too long. And man, I just appreciate you being back on the show.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing, Sean, and I guess I'll see you in a couple of years. If not, hopefully before, but if not, we'll connect in a couple of years.